A story of power buried underground, of a name spoken in the wrong mouth for too long, of a woman who was swallowed by the earth and came back as something the earth itself could not hold, and of the wolf who knew what she was before the man beside him did. The night they buried Maris Aldenvorn alive, the blood moon was already climbing. It hung above the forest like a wound that refused to close, deep red, swollen, casting the kind of light that makes shadows look like they have weight. The men who carried her to the grave did not look up at it. Men doing terrible things rarely look at the sky. The sky has a way of making terrible things feel small, and these men needed to feel large enough to finish what they had started. There was no ceremony, no torch, no word spoken over her. Only the creak of a wooden cart, the soft rhythm of boots on old forest soil, the thud of earth landing on wood, and then silence, the specific silence of a forest that has decided to wait and see what happens next. She was 22 years old. She had done nothing wrong. That is the part the kingdom of Ethermark would spend years trying to bury alongside her. But to understand what came out of that grave at dawn, you must first understand what was put into it. And to understand that, you must go back to the beginning, to a storm, to a child born inside it, to the moment a very old midwife stepped back 2 full paces and pressed her hand flat against her own sternum and could not afterwards explain why. Maris came into the world during a storm that bent century-old trees sideways and drove the livestock into corners. Her mother, Kaline Aldenvorn, gripped the iron headboard of her birthing bed and made no sound at all, which frightened the attendants more than screaming would have. The child arrived at the exact moment the storm broke, and when she drew her first breath and opened her eyes, everyone in the room felt it before they saw it. A pressure in the chest, low and resonant like a note struck on an instrument buried very deep. The child's eyes were amber, not the soft, unfocused gray blue of a newborn. Amber, the color of fire held inside glass, of something looking out from a depth no infant has any right to reach. Then the amber was gone. The child was only a child, small and demanding and furious in the way all children are when they arrive into cold air from warm dark. The midwife did not speak of what she had seen, not that night, not ever. She simply went home, sat in her kitchen until morning, and told herself the firelight had played tricks. She was not entirely successful. Maris's father, Lord Dreven Aldenvorn, warden of the Eastern Reaches, looked at his daughter once that night. He was a man of exact economic feeling, the kind who weighed even his private emotions before permitting himself to have them. And when he looked at the child and felt something enormous move in his chest that had no name in his vocabulary, he did not pursue it. He handed the child back to the nurse. He went to his study. And by morning, he had begun the correspondence that would, very quietly, transfer his daughter's future out of her own hands before she was old enough to understand she had won. The man he corresponded with was Lord Kasrin Veth, Alpha of the Greywood Pack, the oldest wolf bloodline in the eastern half of Ethermark. What Kasrin Veth wanted with an Aldenvorn child was not written in any letter. It lived between the words, in the careful gaps of language that powerful men use when they are discussing something they do not want witnessed. The Aldenvorn bloodline was old, ancient, in the way of things that have been buried so long they are no longer recognized as what they are. There were whispers in cloister records, in the private journals of wolf elders who had lived long enough to remember the last great bonding, that the Aldenvorn line had been present at the first making of the packs, that something had been sleeping in that blood for 3 generations, growing denser with each one, concentrating in the way that rivers concentrate when something upstream narrows their channel. In the child born during the storm with amber eyes that lasted 1 full breath, Kasrin Veth did not see a daughter. He saw a resource that needed to be acquired before anyone else understood what it was. So Maris Aldenvorn was pledged at the age of 3 to Rael Veth, who was 10 years old and already growing into the controlled, physical certainty of an alpha heir, who would one day be very difficult to say no to. Callie stood at the edge of the pledging platform with her hands folded so tightly the knuckles went the color of old linen, and she did not speak, because she had not been given permission to speak, and because by the time she understood what was truly being done, the ink had been dry for 2 full seasons. She did the only thing she could. She went home, and she went to the small cedar box her own mother had left her, and she took out 3 bone-white pins. Pins the grandmother had carried for years, pins carved from the spine of a tree older than the kingdom, pins that held in their careful construction a working that the grandmother had said was for protection. Callie pressed them into her daughter's hair with hands that were not shaking because she did not allow them to shake, and she told herself she was buying the child time. She was right. She was also, in ways she could not predict, handing a key to a lock that the wrong people would spend years trying to open. Maris grew up knowing 3 things about her future: Greywood, Railveth, arrangement. She was not raised unkindly, but kindness and honesty are not the same currency, and the Aldenvorn household spent freely in one and almost never in the other. She learned to read rooms the way other children learned letters. She learned to move through spaces without disturbing them. She learned which questions to keep behind her teeth, and on certain nights, the ones when the moon swelled heavy and the hold breathed in the particular way of a sleeping thing about to wake, she felt the something in her chest press against the inside of her ribs like a creature at the bars of a cage whose name it did not yet know. She never spoke of it. Not to her mother, not to anyone. Until, on the morning of her 16th birthday, she was put into a carriage and driven 4 days east to Greywood Hall. And the something in her chest, for the first time in 16 years, pressed so hard against her ribs she had to press her own hand against them to feel whether it was coming from inside or out. It was inside. It had always been inside. It was simply, for the first time, awake. Greywood Hall sat at the edge of a forest, so old the trees had names. Not the names children give trees, carved in bark and forgotten by summer. The names the wolves used in ceremony, names older than the common tongue, passed down in the pack's oral record for so long that no one was certain what they meant anymore. Only that speaking them too loud in the wrong season made the forest shift and settle like a very large body turning in sleep. Maris arrived on a morning of thin, cold rain. She stepped from the carriage with her traveling cloak dark at the hem, and her hair braided back with the 3 bone-white pins her mother had pressed into her hands at departure. She did not know what the pins were. She only knew her mother's face when she pressed them in careful, and too still, the way faces go when a person is making a decision they cannot explain out loud. She wore them anyway. Railveth was waiting on the steps. He was 26, dark-haired, broad across the shoulders, with the specific physical ease of a man who has never once in his life had to wonder whether a room would accept him. He watched her cross the courtyard with eyes that were doing an assessment she could feel from 20 feet away, not the rude, open assessment of a man who has decided already. The careful kind, the kind that arrives looking for something specific. He didn't speak until she was 5 feet away. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. She stopped. She looked at him with the calm, level gaze her mother had taught her was more powerful than any response that needed volume. "I get that often," she said. "I've learned to take it as useful information about the person saying it." Something moved behind his eyes. Not offense, something more like the quick, internal recalibration of a man whose road has just turned out to have a different surface than the map showed. He looked at her for one more beat. Then he turned and led her inside. The hall was everything Duskwall Hold was not, wide and warm and full of wolves, not metaphorically, but literally. The Greywood pack lived together in Greywood Hall. And the difference between a wolf household and an ordinary one was not decorative. It was alive in the way people moved through the space, with the comfortable, unself-conscious physicality of creatures who understood hierarchy in their bones and therefore never needed to perform it. When 2 pack members passed in the corridor, the lower-ranked ones shifted their body automatically, a subtle lean away, a slight lowering of the chin. No thought, pure instinct. The way water finds its level. They all looked at Maris when she entered. One after another, the glances found her and stayed a half-breath longer than social etiquette required, the way a room notices when the air pressure changes. She noticed them noticing. She filed it away. Lady Thyris Veth greeted her in the receiving room with both hands extended, and warmth so practiced it had the faint, laundered quality of something washed too many times. Beautiful woman. Careful smile. Eyes doing the same assessment Rails had done, but with less honesty about it, the kind that disguises itself as warmth. Maris Aldenvorn, she said, we have been waiting for you. Waiting for what Maris thought, the girl or the bloodline. She smiled and said nothing, and let Lady Thyris lead her away. Her room was on the 3rd floor, large enough to feel significant, not warm enough to feel welcome. The east window overlooked a garden that was beautiful in the spare, architectural way of things that have been designed to be looked at rather than used. She unpacked slowly. She thought about the way the pack had looked at her in the corridor. The way the air in the hall had the faint, electric quality of a room that knows something is happening and is paying attention to it. The first 3 days she was introduced. Pack inner circle, one at a time. Rail's brothers, Sorlin, 23, loud and easy, who greeted her with a genuine grin and a handshake that nearly ground her knuckles together, and Bryce, 20, quiet and sharp-eyed, who greeted her with a nod that meant more than most people's speeches. The pack's elder, Haveth, who was so old his wolf had quieted to a distant warmth behind his eyes, and who studied her with the particular attention of a man reading a document he has been expecting for a very long time. And Catherine Veth himself, who put both hands on her shoulders and smiled, and said welcome in the warm, considered tone of a man who has decided that being liked is a tool rather than a pleasure. She catalogued all of it. She moved through the first days the way she had moved through all 16 years, carefully, revealing only what was safe to show. On the 5th night, she woke at midnight to the sound of the forest. Not leaves or wind. The forest itself, the way it breathes in the specific hour before dawn when everything alive in it has settled into the particular quality of presence that very old things have when they are not performing for anyone. She went to the east window. The moon was 3 days from full, and the forest edge was silver dark, and the something in her chest was pressing so hard against her ribs she had to press her hand flat against her sternum and breathe. You feel it. She turned. Rail was in the doorway. He had not knocked. He was in plain dark clothes with his hair loose, which made him look less like a position and more like a person, and he was looking at her with something she had not seen in his face during the formal days, something unguarded, slightly frustrated, the look of a man confronting something his careful planning did not include. You should have knocked, she said. I know. Why didn't you? A pause. I was in my room and I could, he stopped. His jaw tightened. Then, quieter, I could feel you, awake. At the window, my wolf was, it kept turning toward this side of the hall and I followed it before I thought about whether I should. He looked almost annoyed at himself. That doesn't happen to me. She studied him. You're saying your wolf brought you here? Yes. And you followed it? Yes. The annoyance in his expression deepened. I don't usually do that. My wolf and I have an understanding. I lead, it follows. Something in her chest did a small, involuntary thing at that. Not fear. Something warmer which was less comfortable. What does the forest sound like, she said carefully, when it speaks to you? He looked toward the window. The tightness in his jaw eased just slightly. Like breathing, he said, slower than mine, something very old that has been patient for a very long time. And now? He was quiet, then, now it sounds like it's listening. She turned back to the window. Get some sleep, Rail Veth, she said softly. He did not move immediately. She could feel him still in the doorway, feel him the way you feel a fire at your back, not by seeing it, but by the warmth it puts into the air. She heard the slow, controlled exhale of a man reining something in, then his footsteps back down the corridor, the soft click of the door he left behind. She stood at the window for a long time after that. She pressed her hand to the glass. The glass was cold. Below her palm, the stone sill was warm, warmer than it should have been, warmer than the night air explained. The warmth of something in the stone leaning up toward her the way a fire leans toward whoever comes to sit beside it. She thought about a man whose wolf had walked him down a corridor in the middle of the night against his own judgment, to stand in the doorway of a woman he barely knew. She told herself to be careful. She was right, too. She simply underestimated, at 16, how difficult careful becomes when something in your chest has already made a decision you haven't caught up to yet. Haveth came to her on the 9th day. He came at first light, when the hall was still in the breathing quiet of early morning, and he sat across from her at the long kitchen table with a cup of bitter herb tea, and the unhurried manner of a man who has decided he is done waiting. "You dream," he said, no greeting, no preamble. She looked at him. "Not a question," he said. "A specific dream, the same image for years, you don't know what it means. You've stopped trying to name it." She set her cup down. "Your bloodline," Haveth said, in the deliberate way of someone choosing the order of information carefully, "has not been in the world in its full form for 3 generations. Your grandfather carried it dormant. Your father carries it thinner still. The line has been diluting, the way rivers dilute when the source is blocked." He paused. "In you, it is not diluting." "What is it?" she said. He wrapped his hands around his cup. "There are lines in Ethermark that were present at the first binding, when the wolf was not chosen but given, poured into certain bloodlines by something older than kings and councils, and the names we have for things we don't fully understand." He looked at her directly. "Your bloodline is one of those lines. The Aldenvorn name is in the oldest pack records as one of the 3 original binding families." She held very still, and this family knew. "Catherine knew before your pledge was signed." "Does Rael know?" Haveth considered the question the way he considered everything fully, without rushing it. "Rael knows you are significant," he said at last. "He does not know why. What he does know," a pause. "His wolf knows more than he does. That has been true since you arrived." "What does his wolf know?" Haveth looked at her with the expression of a man who has one truth left to give and is deciding whether the recipient can hold it yet. "That you outrank him," he said. "Not in the human sense, in the oldest sense, the one that has nothing to do with titles or packs or arrangements." He paused. "His wolf has known it since the hour you arrived. Rael has been fighting it because he does not yet have the language for something his instinct recognized before his mind did." She sat with that for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because," Haveth said, setting each word down like a stone in a wall, "I have served 4 alphas and I have learned to recognize when a house is building something it should not build. And the only person who can stop it is almost always the person at the center of it, who has not yet been told they are the center." He rose. He left his tea untouched. He walked to the door. Then he stopped. "The bone pins in your hair," he said, without turning. "Don't take them out. Not until you understand what they are holding and what happens to a room when what they're holding is released." And he left. That afternoon, she found Rael in the east courtyard. He was drilling fighting forms alone, slowly, the way a man drills when he is not training for speed but for memory, working movements into the body, so deep they stop being thought and become reflex. His shirt was dark with sweat. He had not heard her approach, which told her he was distracted. A wolf of his rank should have heard her on the stones from 30 feet away. She sat on the low wall. She watched him. After a while he stopped and turned, and she saw the moment he registered her presence, not the polite, social recognition of a person who has been watched and decided to acknowledge it, but the full-body response of a wolf whose senses had been too occupied with something internal to catch what was right behind him. A slight stiffening, a quick, automatic intake of breath, his eyes finding her immediately, amber-edged for just one flicker before they settled back to dark. She filed that away. "Your father pledged me to you because of my bloodline," she said. "Not because of politics, because of what I carry." He was still. "Did you know?" she said. A long pause. He looked away for just a moment, and she had learned in 9 days of close observation that Rael Veth only looked away when something was true that he wished were not. "I knew you were important to my father's plans," he said. "I didn't know the full reason." "But your wolf knew." His jaw tightened. "My wolf," he said very quietly, "has been difficult since the morning you arrived, and I have not yet decided what to do about that." She stood. She smoothed her dress and looked at him across the courtyard with the clear, unbothered gaze of a woman who has decided to say the true thing plainly. "Then I need you to understand something. Whatever I am, whatever my blood carries, it is mine. Not your father's, not yours, mine. And if you want anything real from me, it will be because you chose it, not because it was written for you." He looked at her for the full length of that. "I know," he said. The thing that undid her was not that he said it. It was that he meant it. She could hear it in the particular quality of silence that follows a true thing rather than a convenient one. She had become, over 16 years of careful observation, very good at telling those apart. She nodded once. She walked back into the hall. That night she lay in her too large room and pressed her hands flat on the bed covers and felt the something in her chest settle into a new shape. Not the pressing urgency of the moon's call. A quieter, more complicated warmth. The kind that takes up residence in the chest of a person who has, against their better judgment, started caring about the outcome of something they were told was not their choice. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and told herself to be careful. Outside her window, the forest breathed. Somewhere on the other side of the hall, she was almost certain, a dark wolf was packing. 6 months. 6 months of evening libraries and morning courtyards. Of conversations that started formal and ended something else entirely. Of Rael appearing in doorways at odd hours and then appearing in her own thoughts at odder hours, which was less convenient. He came to the library most evenings. Not the formal visits, the ones where Catherine's schedule required them to sit in the receiving room under the mild surveillance of passing servants. Those were performances. The library was not. In the library he asked her things no one else at Greywood had thought to ask. What she had read, what she thought about it, what she found when she read between the recorded lines of pack history. "The histories have been edited," she told him one evening, 3 months in, without looking up from the text she was studying. "Old removals, but gaps leave marks the same way scars leave marks. You can see the shape of what was there even after it's gone." He looked up. Across the table, the lamp between them put shadows under his jaw and light in his eyes, and the amber in them was more visible in firelight than in daylight. She had learned this. She had also learned not to think about it too directly. "What do you think was removed?" he said. "Information about certain bloodlines," she said. She let the sentence sit between them open. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maris, there are things my father—" "I know," she said. "You know what specifically?" "I know that I was chosen for what I carry. I know that whatever I carry has been taken out of your written history. I know that Haveth is frightened of your father." She looked at him over the lamp. "And I know that you are not your father." He held very still. And then, slowly, he reached across the table and pushed the lamp slightly to the side, so there was nothing between them and the light fell equally, and he said, "What do you see when you look at your own wolf?" The question surprised her. No one had ever asked her about it that way, as though her wolf was something she could see, as though it had a form she had been living alongside. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I know it's there, I've always known. It presses against the inside of my ribs on full moon nights like something that wants," she paused. "Not out exactly. It doesn't want out, it wants to be recognized. It wants me to stop pretending it isn't there." He nodded slowly. "And do you still pretend?" Every day, she said. He was quiet, then. Mine used to be patient with me when I was younger, it followed my lead. He looked at his own hands on the table. It's not patient anymore. Since when? He glanced up. The amber in his eyes was fully visible now, no effort to contain it. Since the morning you arrived. She held his gaze. She did not look away. Neither did he. The fire in the hearth crackled. Outside, the moon climbed. And somewhere in the old forest at the edge of the property, something moved through the named trees without hurry. She did not reach across the table. He did not either. But the space between them had changed, the way the air in a room changes when a window is opened in winter, sharp and clean, and carrying with it the awareness that the outside is right there, and is colder than you prepared for. She went to bed that night with warm hands and a warm chest, and a very firm private conversation with herself about what was, and was not a sensible thing to feel about a man whose father had purchased her bloodline, and had plans for it she had not yet fully mapped. The conversation did not go as well as she had hoped. 4 months after the library evening, she heard the thing she was not meant to hear. She had been looking for Haveth when she passed the study door not fully closed, which was unusual. Catherine's voice first, then another voice, low and measured, that she did not recognize, and her name, which stopped her. She stood in the shadow of the passage. "Her wolf is waking," Catherine said. "I can smell it on her. It's been climbing for weeks. The fire in her scent, it's different now, heavier, like something building pressure underground." A pause. The bonding must happen before she shifts fully. Once she shifts, we lose the ability to direct where the power flows. "And the pins are still holding," the second voice said. "Yes, but not for much longer. Suppression only works against something that doesn't know it's being suppressed. She's starting to feel the edges of it. I've watched her at the moon windows." He paused. "When she finally shifts, the first full shift of a bloodline like hers will send a signal across every wolf in range. Every pack within 100 miles will feel it. And the wolf she has bonded to becomes her anchor, which means the power concentrates through him, and through whoever stands above him." "You?" "Yes." Maris stood in the passage and understood, with the perfect clarity of a woman hearing her own life read aloud without her permission, exactly what she was. Not a bride, not an heir, not a person at all in this calculation. A power source, with a bone-white pin switch that her own mother had unknowingly installed. She walked back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. She put her hands on her knees and breathed very slowly and deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe when the something in her chest was pressing hard, and she needed to think clearly over the sound of it. The pins were her mother's doing, not Catherine's. She understood that immediately, and she held onto it the way a person holds onto a rope in water, not because it makes the water warmer, but because it keeps you from going under. Colleen had not known the pins would be useful to Catherine Veth. She had put them there to buy her daughter time. She had put them there out of frightened love, which was not the same as betrayal, even when its effect was similar. She sat with that for a long time, then she stood up. She needed Rael. She needed to know which version of him was the real one, the one who had pushed the lamp aside in the library, or the one who had been raised inside his father's plans and might, at the final moment, choose the structure over the person inside it. She found him in the practice yard. He turned when he heard her, and then he went very still, because he could smell it. She saw it happen in real time. The way his nostrils flared slightly and his eyes went immediately amber, and something in his posture shifted. The easy physical confidence replaced by a tension that was not aggression but was close to it. The way a string pulled tight is not broken but is very close to its limit. "Something happened," he said. "Yes." He stopped. He pressed his hand briefly against his own jaw, a gesture she had not seen before, as though steadying something. "Your scent changed. What happened?" She looked at him. Then she told him everything, the study door, the conversation, the pin working, what Catherine's plan required. She told it plainly in order without performing emotion around it, because she needed his response to be to the information and not to how she presented it. When she finished, the practice yard was quiet. Rael was looking at the ground. His hands were at his sides. She watched his jaw. She watched his hands. And then she watched what she had been watching for without knowing she was watching for it. The moment his body made a choice his face had not caught up to. His hands closed, opened again, closed. And when he looked up, his eyes were fully amber, not the flicker she had seen in libraries and doorways, but fully, completely amber, the wolf visible behind them with no effort made to contain it. "He was going to use you as a conduit," Rael said. His voice was controlled. But beneath the control, she heard the register of it, lower than his human voice, slightly roughened, the sound of a man whose wolf had taken over the tone if not the words. "Yes," she said. "He was going to bond you to me." His hands closed again. His breath came hard and slow. "Without your—" "Yes." A sound came from his chest that was not quite human, short, involuntary, the kind of sound a wolf makes when it is confronted with something it finds deeply, biologically unacceptable. He turned away from her and pressed both hands against the stone wall of the practice yard, and she watched the muscles in his back go rigid and then, slowly, deliberately, release. When he turned back, his eyes were dark again. Almost. "What do you need?" he said. "Time," she said. 3 days. He's planning to move soon. I need you to delay whatever he's planning." "And after 3 days?" She looked at him, at the careful, stripped-down face of a man who had just chosen a person over a structure, without drama, without a speech, simply by showing up to the question and answering it honestly. "After 3 days," she said, "I want you to come with me, not as an arranged mate, as a choice, yours and mine." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll give you 3 days," he said. She went back to her room. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed and her hands flat on the stone and the stone warm under her palms and the something in her chest doing something new, not the pressing urgency of the moon, not the complicated warmth of the library evenings. Something quieter and deeper than either. The warm, settled quality of a weight set down. She told herself not to trust it yet. She was right not to, because she had 2 days, not 3, and Catherine Veth had been moving since before she found the study door open. The door, she would realize later, had not been left open by accident. She discovered it the following morning. Haveth found her in the corridor at first light and pressed a folded paper into her hand without stopping, without speaking, and kept walking. She unfolded it against the wall. "He moves tonight, East Gate, now." She looked up. The corridor was empty. She went to find Rael. He was not in the courtyard, not in the library, not in the practice yard or the stables or any of the spaces that had, over 6 months, become predictably his. The hall servant who brought her breakfast told her, with averted eyes, that Lord Rael had been in his father's study since first light. She went cold. Not the cold of fear, the cold of a pattern completing itself. She had 2 hours. She went to her room. She took the bone-white pins out of her hair. She sat on the floor first. She understood instinctively that this was not something to do standing, and she held the 3 pins in her palm and looked at them for a long moment. Her mother's hands pressing them in on a cold morning 16 years ago. Her mother's face, too still, too careful. "I am buying you time," the face had said, without words. The time was up. She took the first pin out. Nothing. The second pin. The air in the room shifted. A change in pressure, subtle, like the moment before weather decides which way to fall. The lamp flame on the desk leaned sideways without any draft to explain it. The third pin. Maris sat down on the floor because her legs made the decision without consulting her, and the something in her chest that had pressed against her ribs for 22 years, that had spoken and breathed and listened and waited, reached the surface. It did not hurt. That was not what she expected. She had spent 16 years quietly preparing for pain, for the violence of a held thing finally breaking through its container. Instead, it felt like a door opening. The soft, weighted exhale of a room that has been closed for too long and is finally allowed to breathe. 22 years of held breath, released in one long, shaking exhalation from a depth she had not known she was holding it at. Her hands on the stone floor were warm, not fever warm. The warmth of the stone recognizing her, of something old in the earth beneath the floor leaning up into her palms the way a hearth leans toward whoever finally comes to sit beside it. She breathed, she stayed on the floor, she let it happen. And then from outside, voices, boots on cobblestones, the quiet, directional movement of men who have been given a task and are executing it efficiently. She was out of time. She stood, she walked to the east gate. 4 of Catherine Veth's men were already there, and Catherine himself, standing behind them with the formal, resolved face of a man who has prepared justifications for what he is about to do and has decided they are sufficient. "Maris," he said, in the patient tone of a man explaining a small misunderstanding, "come back to the hall." "No," she said. "Your future is mine," she said. He nodded once to the man on his left. She fought. She fought the way a person fights when the thing in their chest has been awake for 20 minutes and they do not yet know how to use it, but they know they are done being held, with her hands and her voice and her body, and every piece of the something she could reach. One man's face would show the mark of her elbow for a week. Another man spent the next 3 days nursing a wrist she had twisted at an angle it did not prefer. But there were 4 of them, and Catherine had planned for resistance the way he planned for everything, with a contingency. They put her in a cart. They drove her into the old forest, to the part where the named trees grew in silence so heavy it felt like something listening. And when they stopped, they dug, and she said nothing because she was saving her air and thinking, and the blood moon was rising and filling the forest with light the color of a wound. They put her in the ground. She heard the earth come down and she pressed her hands flat against the wood of the box they had put her in and she breathed. 3 breaths. 6. The air was going thin and she breathed anyway, because the something in her chest was not finished and the floor of the box was warm beneath her palms, warm and listening and very, very patient. She closed her eyes. She stopped thinking in the language of the hall. She went down. She did not die. The earth in that part of the forest, the old part, the part with the named trees, had been there since before the kingdom, since before the pacts, since before the first binding, which meant it had been there when the first binding happened, when the wolf was poured into certain bloodlines by something so old it did not have a name anymore. And the earth remembered. She felt it around her, not the weight of it, not the crushing, suffocating pressure that should have been the only sensory reality of a sealed box underground. She felt the warmth, the same warmth that had come up through the stone floors of Greywood Hall on full moon nights, the same warmth her mother's hearth had on winter evenings. The warmth of something enormous that had been patiently keeping this particular piece of ground, ready for exactly this moment for longer than any person had been alive to keep track of. She put her hands flat against the soil, pressing in on all sides. She breathed, and she let go of the language of halls and arrangements and 16 years of learning to be small, let go of careful and quiet, and the managed distance she had kept between herself and the thing in her chest that she had always known was there and never been allowed to name. Let it all fall the way autumn leaves fall when the branch finally releases them, not in collapse, not in defeat, but in the natural, inevitable motion of a thing done holding on. The wolf came forward. Not in a rush, in a tide, the way a tide comes, not sudden but unstoppable, gathering weight from fathoms deep and arriving with the full authority of everything that was behind it. She felt it move through her from her hands first, the warmth spreading up her arms and into her chest, and her bones did not break, they remembered. A shape the body had always been built for, finally being allowed to inhabit it. The first sensation was hearing. It hit like a wave breaking and she nearly lost the breathing, the sound of every living thing in the forest above her, the heartbeats of small creatures in burrows, the movement of sap in the old trees, the footsteps of Catherine's men 300 yards away, still audible, the creak of their boots and the rhythm of their breathing and the nervous quickness of their pulses. She heard all of it simultaneously, layered and clear, like music heard properly for the first time after years of hearing it through a wall. Then scent. Her mind did not have categories for what she was smelling. Rain coming from the northeast, still 4 hours away, carrying with it the particular cold of high altitude. The old forest-specific underground smell, wet stone and ancient root rot, and something beneath both of those that was neither, something that had no name in the common tongue, and that her wolf recognized immediately as home. Catherine's men. Fierce sweat above their practiced calm. The sour, electric smell of men doing something their bodies know is wrong even when their minds have agreed to it. And beneath all of that, a specific dark scent, distant but clear, moving fast through the forest from the direction of the hall. She knew that scent. She had been learning it, without knowing she was learning it, for 6 months in libraries and courtyards and doorways at midnight. She did not have time to be surprised. She shifted. The box became impossible. Not slowly, the wolf did not fit inside the box, and the box understood this, and the earth understood this, and neither of them attempted to argue with it. She came through the soil not scrambling, not clawing desperately upward, but rising the way a tide rises steadily, with the absolute patience of something that does not believe in obstacles, only in inevitability. She came out of the earth at dawn. The grave soil broke apart and fell away from her coat, and she put 4 paws on the forest floor. She shook the earth from her fur. She lifted her head. She was a silver wolf, not gray, not white. Silver, the precise color of deep water that holds moonlight differently than ordinary water, the color of something that has been in the dark for a long time and has come back carrying the dark's particular quality of clarity. And she was not a small wolf. She was not an ordinary wolf. She was the kind of wolf that the named trees leaned toward, very slightly, the way old things acknowledge the arrival of other old things. She stood in the forest. She breathed. She let the morning air move over her, the rain smell from the northeast, the old earth, the waking birds, the retreating dark. And then she opened her mouth and she howled. The sound went out from her through the named trees and into the old forest and beyond it, moving through the ground as much as through the air, carrying not sound exactly but frequency. The oldest frequency of the wolf bloodline, the one that travels through bone rather than ear, the one that has only one message. I am here, I have always been here, and I am done. In Greywood Hall, 3 miles east, every wolf in the pack woke at the same moment. Not gradually, all at once. Like a single candle lit in a room that has been dark so long the darkness had become comfortable, and now the light arrives and it is total, and it leaves nowhere to hide. Pack members sat up in beds and stood from chairs and came to windows without knowing why, drawn by something below conscious thought, something in the marrow. Sorlin Veth dropped a breakfast cup. He did not notice. His eyes had gone full amber and he was already at the window. Bryce stood from his table and pressed his hands flat against the wall and breathed, and the breath came out shaking. The youngest pack members, 3 teenagers in the back hall, shifted without meaning to, the wolf coming forward in a wave of instinct, their human forms dissolving into animal ones before any of them had decided anything. Haveth, locked in the lower room, sat down on the floor of his cell and wept, not in grief, in relief. In the specific relief of a man who has been right about something for a very long time and finally has the proof of it. Catherine Veth was in his study. He stood so fast his chair fell over behind him. He stood at the window and gripped the frame and his knuckles went white, and his face went through several things in quick succession, recognition, calculation, and then something that was not quite fear but was very close to it. He had planned for power. He had planned for the shift happening in a controlled space with a controlled outcome. He had not planned for the shift happening in the ground he had put her in. He had not planned for this. And Rael. Rael had been in his room since they took her. Not locked in, his father was too careful for that, but surrounded, quietly and constantly, by presence. By the passive management of a man who understood his son well enough to know that direct containment would produce direct resistance, and so chose the slower, subtler kind. When the howl reached him, Rael's wolf did not wait for Rael. His eyes went amber. His hands went to the windowsill and his nails split into claws that scored the wood, and the shift came through him in one long, uncontrolled wave. The most uncontrolled shift he had experienced since he was 14 years old and still learning that the wolf and the man were supposed to work in the same direction. It was not painful. It was the release of 6 months of difficulty. 6 months of his wolf pulling constantly toward a silver-haired girl in a borrowed room 3 corridors away. 6 months of his human side applying careful management to something that did not want to be managed. He hit the courtyard at a run, already fully wolf. A dark wolf, nearly black, broad across the shoulders with the controlled power of a wolf who had spent 26 years training and had never once run toward something this fast or this certain. His father's men ran after him. 3 of them shifted at the gate. They were fast. He was not interested in them. He was running toward a howl that his wolf had been waiting its entire life to answer. And that kind of running has a quality that ordinary running does not. The absolute, uncomplicated clarity of a creature that has stopped negotiating with itself. The silver wolf and the dark wolf met in a clearing half a mile from the grave. She had been moving toward the hall, not running, walking, with the measured, unbothered pace of something that has stopped needing to perform speed because it has understood that it cannot be outrun. The rising sun was behind her, dew on the grass, the forest in the perfect, listening quiet of old things in the presence of something they recognize. She heard him before she saw him. His heartbeat, which she could hear now, the way she could hear everything now, layered and clear, was fast, running fast. And beneath the speed, a specific quality she did not have a human word for, but that her wolf understood immediately. Intent, purpose, not predator intent, something older than that. He came out of the tree line at a run and skidded to a stop when he saw her, the dark wolf's momentum carrying him 3 paces past the point where he'd intended to stop, grass tearing under his paws. Then he was still. They looked at each other across 20 feet of dew-wet clearing. She had been prepared for many responses from him, the complicated response of a pack wolf confronted with something above his rank, the conflicted response of a son whose father's plans were collapsing around him, the careful, managed response of a man who had spent 26 years training his wolf to follow his lead, and was now experiencing the specific difficulty of that relationship revering itself. He went down, not in submission, in asking, both front legs extended, head low to the grass, chin almost touching the ground, eyes up, the body language so ancient it predated the first word the first wolf had ever shaped with a human mouth. The posture of a wolf that is not surrendering to power, but is presenting itself to something it recognizes as worth presenting to. Something in her chest went very still. She walked toward him, slowly. 1 pace, 2, 3. She stopped directly before him and lowered her own head until her nose was level with his. And she breathed him in the real scent of him, the one beneath the hall and the training and the 6 months of careful management. The scent that was all wolf and old forest and something her own wolf named instantly in the oldest language, the one that did not need a mouth. She put her nose against the side of his jaw, very gently. He exhaled, long, slow, the specific exhale of a creature releasing something it has been holding for far too long. They stayed there in the clearing in the morning. Then Catherine Veth's 3 wolves came out of the tree line. She did not shift back to human. This was deliberate. She let Catherine's men feel her rank not by posturing, not by baring teeth, but simply by standing in the full presence of what she was, which was something so far above the rank of 3 pack wolves that the gap between them was not a competition. It was a category difference. And the wolves in those 3 men knew it before the men did. She watched it happen in real time. The involuntary lowering of ears, the backward lean in their body language, the specific kind of stillness that happens when an animal's instinct and its orders are actively at war with each other. Rail shifted back to human. He stood to her left. His arms were folded. His eyes were still amber. The lead wolf shifted back. His name was Edrek. He looked at Maris and then at Rail, and in his face was the expression of a man whose instructions have just collided with something his body considers non-negotiable. "Lord Rail," he said. "No," Rail said. "Your father commands." "My father," Rail said in the quietest version of his voice, which was the most final version, "does not command here. Go back. Tell him what you found." Edrek looked at the silver wolf. He looked at Rail. He looked at the 2 wolves behind him who had not advanced, and were not going to advance, and clearly had opinions about this that they were keeping to themselves with visible effort. He turned, he left. The other 2 followed. Maris shifted back. She stood in the clearing in her human form with bare feet on dew-cold grass and her hair loose, and her dress torn at the shoulder from the struggle at the gate. And she was not cold, which she noticed distantly and filed away for later. "He tried to bury me," she said. "I know," Rail's jaw worked. "I went to your room when I got to your room I found the pins on the floor and I understood what he'd done." He stopped. Something moved across his face, a grief that he did not soften or redirect. "There is nothing I can say that makes it." "I'm not asking you to make it anything," she said. "I'm asking what you're going to do." He looked at her with the full weight of that. Catherine Veth's voice came from the tree line before he could answer. The alpha of the Greywood pack walked out of the forest in his human form, flanked by 4 more of his men. And for the first time in the months she had known him, Maris saw his wolf come forward without permission, in the set of his jaw, in the quality of stillness that was not peace but control, in the way the air around him carried the dense pressure of an alpha who is accustomed to every wolf in his range, feeling his authority in their bones. She felt it, his alpha pressure, the particular weight of it, heavy and deliberate, the kind that lesser wolves experienced as a hand on the back of the neck, pushing down. She felt it and she stood inside it and she did not move, and what happened next was not something she planned. Her own presence answered it. Not with volume, not with aggression, with simple, overwhelming weight, the weight of something so much older and denser than Catherine Veth's authority that his alpha pressure did not so much meet hers as encounter it and lose coherence. The way a stone wall encounters a tide and discovers too late that force and depth are not the same thing. The 4 men with Catherine went down. Not fully, they caught themselves, shocked by their own body's response, grabbing tree trunks in each other's arms and fighting the instinct that was pulling them toward their knees. 2 of them lost the battle. They were on the ground before they understood what was happening, the wolf in them surrendering to something their human minds had not yet processed. Catherine himself did not go down, but she watched the effort it cost him, the white-knuckled resistance, the controlled, rigid stillness of a man pushing back against his own biology with every piece of authority he had accumulated in 30 years of dominance. Rail made a sound she had never heard from him, not a word, a low, involuntary sound of pure amazement. Catherine looked at her, really looked, for the first time, not at the resource or the arrangement or the bloodline he had spent years acquiring. At the woman standing in the clearing with bare feet and torn dress and the absolute, quiet, total certainty of something that has been waiting underground for 22 years and has now come up. "I only wanted to secure this family," he said. The authority was gone from his voice. What was left beneath it was older and smaller, and she recognized genuine, not a performance, a truth, the wrong truth, held the wrong way, used for the wrong purposes, but real. The Veth line has been weakening for 3 generations, the old power going thin. I needed. "You needed," she said, Something that belonged to my bloodline, and you acquired it the way you acquire land, and you put it in the ground when it became inconvenient. She held his gaze. I am not land. He was quiet. What will you do? He said to Rael after a long moment. I will go where she goes, Rael said, because I choose to. Catherine looked at his son, his heir, the young man he had been shaping since birth into the instrument his ambition required. He looked at the way Rael was standing, not apart from her, but with her, in the body language of a wolf that has found its ground and stopped looking for permission to stand on it. The grief in his face was real. Then go, he said quietly, and take Haveth. He has been working for something other than my interests since before you were born, and he deserves better than to finish in my service. He paused. And take these. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. The full Aldenvorn bloodline record, the version that was sealed. I've had it for 20 years. He looked at Maris directly. It belongs to you. She took it. She did not thank him. But she held his gaze for one long moment, and what she gave him in that look was not forgiveness. Not yet. But the honest acknowledgement that grief and guilt in the right measure are the beginning of something, even when they come too late to change what they're mourning. He turned, he walked back into the forest. His men followed him. The clearing was quiet. Rael looked at her. Where do we go? To the High Council, she said. What was done to me should not be done in the dark to anyone. It should be said in a room full of witnesses in plain language. She paused. And then I want to go to my mother. And after... She looked at him, at the amber still present in his eyes, at the careful, honest face of a man who had run through a forest at dawn and put himself on the ground before her, not because she demanded it, but because his wolf had recognized what his human side was still finding the words for. After, she said, we choose, with our eyes open. He almost smiled, the full version, the one she had been watching for across 6 months of library evenings. Not quite yet. Close. Let's get Haveth, he said. The High Council of Ethermark met in the capital city of Kethara, in a long pale stone building that smelled of old authority and candle wax. Maris walked into it on the 12th day of travel with road dust on her boots and Rael beside her and Haveth and Sorlin and Bryce behind her, and she walked in the way she had learned to walk through every room that expected to assess her, calmly, and with her full presence, and without performing anything. The council was 12, old mostly. Powerful in the way of people trusted with important things for so long they have stopped expecting to be surprised. They looked at the young woman in travel-worn clothes who met each of their gazes in sequence, and one or two of them shifted in their chairs, with the small discomfort of people discovering they are being assessed rather than doing the assessing. She spoke for nearly 2 hours. She did not perform emotion, and she did not strip it out. She spoke in the honest, clear voice of a woman giving information that matters, and she used the word buried without softening it, and looked directly at the 12 faces that needed to hear it, and she watched them lean forward. The collective lean of people whose comfortable posture of authority has just been disturbed by something true. She spoke about the bloodline, about the pins, about what the forest had held and what she had discovered in the earth and what she had done when she came out of it. She spoke about Haveth and Kaleen and the sealed Aldenvorn records Catherine had handed her in the clearing. She spoke about Catherine's plan, the bonding before the shift, the transfer of power, the 20 years of quiet acquisition that had preceded it. When she was finished, the council's elder, a woman named Varys, 80 years old, bright-eyed in the specific way of someone who has outlived so much that nothing surprises them, but some things still interest them enormously, leaned forward and said, "May I see you shift, child?" "That depends," Maris said. Varys' eyebrow rose. "On what?" "On whether this council wants to see me because I am a curiosity, or because I am a citizen whose rights were violated and whose account requires the full evidence." Around the table, something moved, not quite laughter, not quite admiration, something between the two that was more real than either. As a citizen, Varys said. Maris nodded. She shifted. The silver wolf stood in the High Council's hall. She was considerably larger than the hall was designed to comfortably accommodate. The ceiling was 12 feet high. She did not need to duck, but the proportions of the room changed around her the way proportions change when something is placed inside a space it was not built for. She stood in perfect stillness, which was a deliberate kindness on her part, and she let the room feel her. It felt her. 2 of the 12 council members went involuntarily silent in a way that had nothing to do with courtesy. 3 of them pressed back slightly in their chairs without awareness of doing it, the body responding before the mind approved the response. 1 reached for the table's edge and held it. An elder Varys, who had not moved and who met the silver wolf's gaze directly, did something that surprised Maris even in wolf form. The old woman's eyes went wet. Not in fear, in recognition. The expression of a person seeing something they have spent a long time believing did not exist anymore and finding, unexpectedly, that they were wrong. Maris shifted back. Varys said to the room, "I believe we have grounds for an inquiry into the conduct of Lord Cassrin Veth." And then she said to Maris, "And I believe this council owes you an explanation about why the Aldenvorn bloodline records were sealed at council level 20 years ago, which we should have disclosed before a powerful man had the opportunity to use that silence against you." A pause. "I apologize for that." Maris looked at her. "I would like to hear the explanation," she said, "and then I would like it corrected." It took most of the afternoon. It was painful in places and illuminating in others, and in others still, it was simply the long, complicated portrait of how old power is managed by people who are frightened of it, which is not usually malice, but is almost always cowardice wearing administration as a costume. By the end of the afternoon, she understood herself in ways she had not before, and she accepted that the sealing had been an error of caution rather than an act of malice, and she made clear that the difference did not eliminate the damage the error had caused. Varys accepted this, which was the beginning of something. That evening in the rooms the council had given them, Rael sat across a low table from Maris with 2 cups of tea. The fire burned low. Outside, the city of Cathara made the particular sound of a large place at night, constant, layered, indifferent. "Your mother's letter came," he said, and placed a folded paper on the table. She picked it up. Read it slowly, her lips moving slightly on the harder parts. When she reached the end, "I love you and all the versions of you there are," she folded it and held it for a long moment without speaking. "She knew," she said, "my whole life." She used what she had, he said, not defending Callin, just seeing her clearly. "Yes." She put the letter in her pocket. She looked at Rael across the table. He looked back with the quiet, careful attention of a man who has learned, over 6 months of libraries and courtyards and 1 sunrise in a clearing, that this woman does not need to be fixed or saved. She needs to be honestly witnessed. "Will you come with me?" she said, to her. "Yes," he said. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held it, and the warmth of it went through her the way all real warmth does when you have been cold for long enough, slowly and completely, and in every direction at once. Neither of them spoke. The fire burned. Outside in the dark city, the moon was rising full and silver-white, and in the old forest 300 miles east, the named trees leaned slightly toward a particular piece of earth where the grave had been, and then straightened, and were only trees again. The inquiry lasted 43 days. Maris had specifically asked that it not be made into a spectacle, which disappointed certain members of the court who had been looking forward to the dramatic material such proceedings sometimes provided. Instead, it was exactly what she had promised in the clearing, plain language, in a room with witnesses. The archivist read the evidence. The testimonies were given haveth for 3 hours, in a voice so steady it was more devastating than any emotion would have been. The sealed records were unsealed and entered into the permanent record. The document Catherine had handed her in the clearing was read aloud in full. Catherine attended every session. He sat at the inquiry table in his formal clothes and answered every question directly and without evasion. And if there was something in his face across those 43 days that had not been there before, a quality of attention that was different from the strategic attention she had watched him apply to every situation in the months she had known him. It was the specific attention of a man who is hearing his own life read back to him in a room full of witnesses, and discovering that the version in the record is not the version he told himself. He was stripped of the Greywood wardenship. The PAC's governance passed under council supervision to a reformed elders' council structure, which Haveth received with the quiet, satisfied expression of a man whose patience has been vindicated after a very long wait. Catherine returned to Greywood Hall as a private citizen. He lived in the quieter rooms. He read. In the years when Maris and Rael visited, which they did, because Rael was his son and damage is not the same as severance. He was honest rather than warm, which was the more useful thing, and the honesty grew slowly in the way honest things grow. Not quickly, not dramatically, but in the direction of light. Haveth moved to Cathara and joined the council's records office, which suited him so entirely that Maris suspected he had been angling for it in some private corner of himself for decades. He visited on feast days and brought the children dried fruit in impractical quantities, and sat in their kitchen with his tea, and looked at the world with the satisfied expression of someone who has outlived the worst of what they feared, and earned the right to enjoy what's left. Maris went to Duskwall Hold on a morning in early spring. She went alone. Rael offered and she asked him to wait. Some conversations needed to be had without witnesses, even beloved ones. Calline was in the kitchen garden, doing the purposeless weeding of a woman who is waiting for something and needs her hands occupied. She looked up when she heard footsteps on the path, and she went very still. Then she crossed the garden without her usual careful composure and put both arms around her daughter and said nothing for a long time. Maris held her back. The bone-white pins were in her pocket. She had carried them there since the clearing. She did not take them out yet. They were not ready for that conversation yet. She only held her mother in the spring garden and let the holding be its own complete thing. Later, over tea, Calline told her everything. The grandmother who had cracked a hearthstone on her first shift, the years of management that followed, Lord Dreven's fear and his correspondence with Catherine Veth, the pins, their origin, their working, the morning Calline had pressed them into the hair of a 3-year-old child who could not be told what they were. "I should have found another way," Calline said. "You didn't have another way," Maris said. "You had what you had, and it kept me alive long enough to understand what I was before someone used it against me." She paused. "The using against me happened anyway, but that was not yours." Calline looked at her. At the daughter who had come back from a grave and a borrowed hall and a capital inquiry with the specific quality of someone who has been through the refining fire and come out not harder but clearer. The way metal clarifies in a forge, not destroyed but made more precisely itself. "Tell me about him," she said. The letter said complicated. Maris did. She took her time. She told it honestly, which meant slowly and in order, because the honest telling of a complicated thing is never a brief one. She told the library evenings and the midnight doorway and the courtyard, the lamp pushed aside, the clearing at dawn, the hand over hers on a table in a capital room. When she finished, Calline was quiet for a moment. "Is he honest?" she said. "More and more," Maris said. "He's learning to be. I trust that more than someone who claims to have always been." Calline nodded once. Then, "He's been at the village inn for 2 days." "Yes." "Waiting." "Yes." "Go and get him," said Calline, with the tone of a woman who has decided the matter, before his patience becomes irritating. Maris walked the road from the kitchen garden to the village in the spring morning. She knew this road. She had walked it since she was 4 years old, to the lower market, to the village well, to the specific hollow in the old oak where she had once kept a jar of pressed flowers, and a list of questions she was not allowed to ask aloud. She walked it now with her hands in her pockets and her feet knowing every stone without needing her attention, and she was not the girl who had packed a trunk 4 days east on her 16th birthday. She knew that. She carried everything that girl had been: the quiet, the careful distance, the life lived in the space between what she was and what she had been allowed to show, and she carried it without being defined by it, which is a different thing and takes longer and is more durable. She found Rael at the inn's kitchen table, a book face down at his elbow. He looked up when she came in and set the book aside. "How was it?" he said. "Good." She sat down across from him. "She wants to meet you. She said to come before your patience becomes irritating." His mouth moved, the almost smile. "Am I irritating?" "She hasn't decided yet." "And you?" She looked at him across the table. The easy, honest face of a man who had folded himself onto his knees in a clearing at dawn and run through a forest with no plan except that the howl required an answer. "Not yet," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. They sat in the inn's kitchen in the spring morning with the light coming through the low window, and the smell of bread and warm wood, and Maris thought about the something in her chest. The thing that had pressed against her ribs for 22 years and had been a pressure, and then a voice, and then a wolf, and then a warmth, and was now simply there, settled, present. The way a fire is present when it has found the right hearth and been given enough air. Steady and sure and quietly, completely alive. "Let's go," she said. They walked up the road together. Rael walked beside her, not behind her, not ahead, beside her, which was the correct distance and had been since the clearing and would be, she understood, for a long time to come. The spring morning was cold and bright. The mountains above Duskwall Hold wore their winter white at the peaks but were losing it below, the snow retreating up the rock face like something slowly, finally releasing its grip. New leaves in the western forest. Birds doing what birds do in spring, loudly and with conviction. At the bend in the road, Callie was in the front garden. She saw them coming and stood still for a moment, watching the distance or the lack of it, understanding from the quality of the space between two people something important about what had been chosen. She looked at Rael when they reached the gate. Long, measuring, the look of a woman who has spent 22 years of frightened love on one person and has very specific opinions about who is going to stand anywhere near that investment. Rael met it without deflection. He met it the way he had learned to meet difficult things, directly, with the honest face of a man who is not going to offer a more comfortable version of what is actually true. Callie looked at him for 3 long breaths. Then she opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "The tea is still warm." 4 years after the inquiry, the Silver Wolf and the Dark Wolf were known throughout the eastern reaches of Ethermark not by their names, but by what happened when they ran together in the old forest north of Duskwall Hold. Travelers on the high road in the early mornings sometimes saw them, 2 shapes moving through the old trees in the pre-dawn dark, silver and black against the pale snowlight, moving with the synchronized ease of creatures who have learned each other's rhythms down to the breath. They did not run the same way. The Dark Wolf was trained power, all controlled strength and deliberate movement, the wolf of a man who had spent 26 years learning discipline. The Silver Wolf moved differently, not trained, but natural, with the unhurried, inevitable quality of something that has finally been allowed to occupy the space it was built for. They were not the same. They fit. Word spread the way word spreads about things that are witnessed rather than described, imprecisely and powerfully, and in the direction of wonder. In Greywood Hall, the restored pack records were published in their full form for the first time in 20 years. Haveth had dictated what should be there from memory, every gap, every edited removal, every deliberately forgotten name. The scholars who received the restored records sat with them for 3 days before any of them spoke, the silence of people who have just realized that what they thought was the whole story was an edited draft, and the original is something else entirely. Catherine Veth read the restored records in his quiet rooms. He read them the way a man reads a document that describes his own actions from outside the story he told himself about them. It was not a comfortable process. He undertook it anyway, with the slow, deliberate application of a man doing the only form of repair available to him: honesty after the fact. It would not undo the damage. He had stopped expecting it would. Sorlin Veth met a woman from the northern borderlands who shifted into a gray wolf the size of a small pony and could outrun him on flat ground, which he found so delightful that he proposed within the month. They were the loudest couple at every family gathering for the rest of their lives, and the most genuinely happy, and Maris loved them both unreservedly. Bryce never married. He was, by general consensus, content. The bond between Maris and Rael was never formally performed in the manner Catherine had planned, the ritual bonding rite with its elder and its ceremony, and its specific, managed transfer of power. What they had instead was not performed at all. It happened gradually over months in the way real things happen, in the middle of ordinary days, in the spaces between spoken words, in the particular quality of sleep that belongs to people who have decided to trust something and found that the deciding, repeated enough times, becomes its own kind of certainty. The wolf recognized it before either of them named it. Rael's wolf had been certain since a clearing at dawn. Maris's wolf had been certain since a first breath of dark wolf, sent in a forest that remembered her. Their daughter was born on a clear autumn night, in a storm. She arrived in a rush of wind, and she drew her first breath and opened her eyes, and the attending elder stepped back 2 paces and pressed her hand flat against her own chest, and her eyes were amber, and the amber lasted 3 full breaths this time before it settled into the calm, considering gray of a child who has arrived with strong opinions about the world and is still deciding how to organize them. They named her Kale, after the sound of the wind on the night she was born, and for no other reason, because Maris had had enough of names carrying expectations and wanted her daughter named only after the moment she came into the world. Colleen was in the room when she was born. She held the child for a long time after, without speaking, with the particular expression of a woman who has spent 22 years of frightened love on one person and is now holding evidence that the love was not wasted. Rael sat on the edge of the bed with his hand on Maris's shoulder and watched them both, and his face was the open, unmanaged face of a man who has stopped needing to be careful about what he lets himself feel, because he has found, over 4 years of choosing the same person every morning, that the feelings are not the problem he was trained to believe they were. They are, in fact, the evidence. On the night of the child's first full moon, she was 3 months old and sleeping in her cradle with the ferocious, opinionated certainty of a person who has decided exactly where she stands on the subject of sleep. Maris and Rael went out into the old forest, and they shifted and they ran. Not long, not far, just the 2 of them under the full white moon in the old trees that had been there since before everything, the silver wolf and the dark wolf moving through the names that the trees still carried. And somewhere deep in the old part of the forest, where the grave had been and was not any more, where the earth had broken apart to release something it refused to hold, the ground was warm, not with decay, not with memory of violence, with something older than both, the warmth of a thing that has been present for a very long time and has, at last, been given the correct name. The silver wolf stopped at that place. She put her nose to the earth. The dark wolf came and stood beside her. They were still for a long moment, 2 wolves in a moonlit forest, standing at the place where the hardest part of the story had been buried and had refused to stay. And then the silver wolf lifted her head, and she opened her mouth and she howled. Not in pain, not in anger. In arrival. The sound went out through the named trees and through the old forest and through the ground itself, and it carried, in the oldest frequency of the wolf, one piece of information. I am here, I have always been here. And far across the kingdom of Ethermark, in 100 sleeping holds and a dozen pack houses, and in the homes of wolves who had been awoken by that first howl, and had never fully been able to go back to the sleep they'd had before it. Every wolf lifted their head, and one by one in the dark they answered. Not in obedience, not in submission, in recognition, in the specific involuntary response of creatures who know, in the oldest language their bodies speak, that something they had been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting, without knowing what they waited for, had arrived. The kingdom went quiet, and then slowly it breathed again. And the two wolves in the old forest turned and ran for home, silver and black against the white of the full moon's light, and the named trees leaned slightly as they passed, and the old forest settled, and the night held them gently. And in the cradle by the warm hearth in the house at the edge of the trees, the child with amber eyes slept on, dreaming the old dream, the one that would take her years to understand. She was not afraid of it. She had her mother's blood. She had time. Dear listener, if you stayed with me through all of it, through the grave and the clearing and the forest and the long, chosen years of the ordinary life on the other side of it, I want to know where this story landed in your chest. Leave me a number, 1 to 10, in the comments below. And if the silver wolf warmed you even a little, consider staying for the next one. There are more stories underground, and I would very much like to be the one who brings them up.